Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class, a production of iHeartRadio.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
And I'm Holly Fry.
While we were in Iceland, we had this amazing local guide named Guðjón who went by God. And God was full of knowledge about Icelandic history, and the trip also involved a lot of bus rides. So those bus rides were full of God telling us all about the history of where we were going. I don't actually remember whether we were on the bus or at one of the places that we visited. But one of the people that he told us about was Jón Arason, who was the last Catholic bishop in Iceland before it became a Lutheran country. This story had a lot of gory details, including a pretty gruesome beheading. So, of course, I was like, that's going on the list. There's a lot of writing about Jón Arason in Icelandic. There's way less writing about him in English. So if you're from Iceland, you might know more about him than we do. And you will probably, or I will say certainly, say all the names in this episode better than we will do.
100%. As a quick bit of background, the Norse settled Iceland in the 9th century, and around the year 930, a national parliament was established, known as the Althing. A thing was essentially an assembly or council, and smaller things were held across Iceland. The Althing was the one that brought the whole island together every summer as both a legislative and judicial body. Chieftains and other representatives would discuss and pass laws, and judges would hear cases that hadn't been handled through one of the smaller things. The Althing still exists today, although it meets at a parliament building in Reykjavik rather than at the assembly fields or Thingvellir, which is where it met historically.
Yeah, it's often described as the oldest parliament in the world. There's various debate about whether that's correct or not, but...
And it has great acoustics.
Yes. Overwhelmingly, these first Norse settlers were polytheistic. The spread of Christianity starting in the 10th century led to strife and sometimes violence, which was also happening in other parts of the Norse world. King Olaf Tryggvason Christianized Norway by force after coming to power there in the year 995. There had been other people who had tried to do that, but Olaf is the person that's usually pointed at as successful. He also sent missionaries to other Nordic countries, including Iceland. In the face of all of this, the question of whether Iceland should become Christian came before the Althing.
The Althing decided that Iceland would become a Christian nation around the year 1000. The Diocese of Skálholt was established in 1056, about 80 kilometers or 50 miles east of Reykjavik. The Diocese of Hólar was established in 1106 near the northern coast of the island, essentially on the opposite side of Iceland from Vik. The Diocese of Skálholt covered about 2/3 of the country, while the Diocese of Hólar covered the other third.
Most sources say that Jón Arason was born in northern Iceland in 1484, but some sources argue that it was really a decade earlier than that in 1474. There's not much detail known about his early life. Sometimes his family is described as poor, and other times of reasonable means. After his father died, possibly during the course of Jón's education, he took care of his mother.
Jón was ordained in about 1507 at the age of about 23. He started living with a woman named Helga Sigurdardóttir in what was basically a civil union or a common law marriage. For the most part, Catholic clergy in Iceland weren't observing a tradition of celibacy at this point. Jón's father had also been the son of a monastic prior. Jón and Helga had 9 children together, 6 of whom lived until adulthood.
The bishop of Hólar at this time was Gottsálk Nicolason, who seems to have put a lot of trust in Jón. Gottsálk sent him on missions to Norway at least twice, once to get some timber for the church and once to deliver gold that was going to be made into a chalice. In 1519, Gottsálk also absolved Jón of any sin that was associated with his relationship with Helga. Although both clergy and lay people in Iceland generally seem to have thought it was fine for priests to have common law partners, that was not as true for bishops. So this absolution was probably because Gottskálk was planning for Jón to be his successor.
Bishop Gottskálk died the following year in 1520, when Jón was about 36. This circles back around to the questions about his birth year. His rise through the leadership of the diocese is seen as very fast if he was really ordained around 1507 when he was about 23. But it wouldn't have been so unusual if he was really in his mid-40s when Gottskálk died. Regardless, in addition to taking on increasing power and responsibility within the church, Jón had become prosperous and prominent in northern Iceland, much like a powerful chieftain. When a group of clerics met to choose an interim leader for the see, they chose Jón almost unanimously.
Jón did still have some detractors, though, and a different group of clergymen also met and put forth a different candidate of their own named Piotr Paulsen. It seems like they intended for Jón and Piotr to have sort of equal power and responsibility, but Piotr gave up this role by the following April, and that left Jón in charge.
Holar also wasn't the only place where Jón had enemies. Olmundur Paulsen, bishop of the southern diocese in Skalholt, had been in Norway being consecrated when Bishop Gottskálk died. Norway had taken control of Iceland in the 13th century, and the Icelandic diocese reported to the Archdiocese of Nidaros, which is now Trondheim. Nidaros had been the capital of Norway, and although the capital had been moved to Oslo, Nidaros was still Norway's religious center. The Archbishop of Nidaros had made Olmundur interim bishop of Holar until a new bishop could be elected.
Olmundur seems to have really hated Jón. If Jón really was only in his mid-30s, this might have been related to his age. It was probably also connected to how powerful Jón had become in northern Iceland. He had a reputation for being really ambitious and assertive, and it's possible that Olmundur thought this would sort of tip the balance of power between the two dioceses. Regardless of the exact reasoning, Olmundur started trying to remove Jón from power. He wrote to Pope Clement VII about it, and he also tried to put Piotr Paulsen back in charge of the see. The northern clergy refused to recognize this, and on August 18th, 1522, they elected Jón to be the next bishop. They wrote to the Archdiocese of Nidaros to both name Jón as their choice for bishop and to complain about Olmundur's behavior.
Olmundur tried to stop Jón from going to Norway to be consecrated, so Jón made arrangements to travel there aboard a German merchant ship. Olmundur tried to take the matter to court before riding north with a group of men, possibly as many as 300, to physically stop Jón from leaving. Olmundur also sent word to the German merchants that they would be attacked if they left Iceland with Jón aboard. Jón sent a priest named Magnus back to Holar with a copy of a letter that he had written to the Archbishop of Nidaros, outlining everything that had happened and saying that Olmundur should go to Nidaros to answer for his actions. In what seems like a pretty astute move, Magnus read them this letter through a window where they could not reach him.
Although the German merchants initially had to turn back because of some bad weather, Jón did ultimately make it to Norway with them. Olmundur was probably hoping that the king, King Christian II, and the Archbishop of Nidaros would refuse to recognize Jón as bishop. Olmundur already had relationship with both of those men because of the time he had spent in Norway for his own consecration. But Christian II was forced off the throne after a revolt in early 1523, and the archbishop who had consecrated Olmundur had died by the time Jón arrived. There were different people in charge. The king was now Frederick I, who Jón developed a friendly relationship with, and the new Archbishop of Nidaros, Olaf Ingilbertsson, cleared Jón of all the charges against him on August 9th of 1524, and formally consecrated him as Bishop of Holar.
There is a possibly apocryphal story about Jón's coronation, which is that toward the end of the ceremony, his mitre fell off. That's the ceremonial headpiece worn by bishops. As a couple of page boys raced to pick it up, he said something along the lines of, "That's how my episcopal career will end."
We'll have some more after a sponsor break. When Jón Arason returned to Iceland in 1525, he became one of the country's wealthiest and most powerful men. He was the bishop of one of the country's two dioceses, and the church was deeply interconnected with every level of Iceland's social fabric. He also had control of more than 100 farms that had been left to the church by a wealthy landowner. But he continued to be at odds with Ömmundur and the Diocese of Skálholt for at least the next couple of years. This came to a head with both Jón and Ömmundur showing up at the 1527 Althing with more than 1,000 men apiece. There may have even been a duel between their champions at the Althing that year. Eventually, though, these two men started to tolerate each other. It seems like eventually they were like, that guy's not going anywhere. He's been formally consecrated. I just got to live with it.
There's not a lot of documentation about Jón's first years as a bishop beyond that. He did introduce the printing press to Iceland, probably around the year 1535. Iceland's first printer was a Swedish priest named Jón Matthíasson. Some documents from this press still survive today, and it is possible that Jón authorized a translation and printing of an Icelandic Bible. But if that is true, no copies of that Bible survive. He also wrote poetry, most of it religious or devotional. Some sources describe him as the greatest poet of his generation. And he worked on advancing his sons' careers, playing a big enough role in their upward mobility that some sources describe it as nepotism. He also arranged marriages for his daughters to wealthy men.
These same years were tumultuous elsewhere in the Norse world. In 1533, King Frederick I died. This led to a war of succession in Denmark, known as the Count's War or the Count's Feud. On one side was Christian II. That was the one who had been deposed back in 1523. And then on the other side was Frederick's only son, Christian, who was the ultimate victor and became King Christian III.
Christian III was a devout Lutheran. Martin Luther was a German theologian who had initially intended to try to reform the Catholic Church, but he had been excommunicated in 1521. The reform movement he was part of had evolved into a schism in which reformers broke from the Catholic Church and started establishing new denominations. Today, this is known as the Protestant Reformation. After coming to the throne in Denmark, Christian III immediately began the process of turning it into a Lutheran nation, which was something he had already done in territory that he controlled before becoming king.
This included things like arresting the Catholic bishops and seizing all their assets, and introducing a Lutheran church order that had been approved by Martin Luther himself. Christian then did the same in Norway after ascending to the throne there in 1537. Of course, all of this is an entire other story that we are not getting into today.
Bishops Jón and Ömmundur recognized that the king's religious efforts were a threat and that he would probably try to implement Lutheranism in Iceland. And he did. He had the Lutheran church order read at the Althing in 1538. Not much is known about the bishop's response to this first reading, but it doesn't seem like it led to meaningful changes right away. Also, this was not the first time Lutheranism was introduced to Iceland. It was likely introduced by German merchants earlier in the 1530s, and there was at least one Lutheran church in Iceland by 1537. It was also common for promising young men to be sent to Germany to study, and as Martin Luther grew in prominence, they started to be exposed to his ideas there.
It did not take long for things to escalate in Iceland, though. In 1539, Iceland's governor was Klaus van der Marwitsen. His representative, Diedrich van Minden, led a small group of men in an attack on the monastery at Viðey, on an island northeast of Reykjavik. They expelled all the monks and they seized the monastery and all of its lands and assets. When the Althing convened not long after that, Ominder questioned the men who were involved with this, and the assembly excommunicated both the governor and Dietrich van Minden. Ominder sent a letter to the king, signed by most of the southern clergy and a lot of lay people, detailing what had happened.
But Dietrich tried to do this again at another monastery not long after, and he and his men stopped in Skalholt on the way, where they insulted and harassed the bishop and in some accounts physically assaulted him. In response, a group of farmers rose up and killed Dietrich and his men on August 10th. Icelandic courts condemned the governor and acquitted the farmers who were involved.
By the time word reached Denmark about what had happened, it was too late to send reinforcements to Iceland. Travel between Denmark and Iceland wasn't really possible in the winter. Everything was frozen. So, since many of Denmark's representatives in Iceland had been killed and Icelandic courts were not recognizing the authority of the governor, over that winter, Iceland was more or less out of Denmark's control. But what had happened, these killings, that was also a major issue to the king. So when travel resumed in the spring, he wanted to both regain control of Iceland and accelerate its conversion to Lutheranism. And then there were also rumors spreading that Ominder had ordered those killings, so the king wanted somebody to get to the bottom of that too.
Meanwhile, both Jón Arason and Ominder Paulsson had written to the king to express their loyalty to Denmark, but also maintain their dedication to their existing religion and traditions. Jón also said that if the king insisted that Iceland adopt these Lutheran religious reforms, Catholics should be allowed to leave the island and resettle in whatever place God showed them.
Although Jón and Ominder were now solidly on the same side, and they were both trying to keep Iceland as a Catholic country, they were at very different points in their lives and their careers as bishops. Jón was 56, or maybe 66 if you're going by that earlier birth year. He was still really active, and as we've said, he was one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in northern Iceland. But Ominder was in his 80s and had lost most of his eyesight. He had already tapped his nephew Sigmund as his successor, but Sigmund had then died in Norway shortly after being consecrated. Ominder's second choice was his assistant, Gissur Einarsson, who was already in Norway when Didrik van Minden and his men were killed. Gissur was sent back to Iceland as bishop-elect, but without formally being consecrated yet, possibly because of his age. He was only 28. He arrived back in Iceland in May of 1540.
What Ominder apparently did not know was that Gissur was a Lutheran. When Gissur appeared at the Althing that summer, he read the Lutheran order and Christians' command that it be adopted in Iceland and that Didrik's killers be brought to justice. After discussing these issues, the Althing wrote back to the king, refusing to adopt the church order and maintaining not only that Ominder had not ordered the killings, but also that the perpetrators had already been tried and acquitted under Icelandic law. The Althing also asked the king for a new governor, which did lead the king to recall and imprison Klaus Vander Marvitsen.
Another complication was that in addition to Gissur, there were multiple other Lutherans in Ominder's household and at the Diocese of Skalholt. It really just kind of reads to me like a hotbed of secret Lutheranism. One of these was Ominder's secretary, Oder Gottskalksson, who was the son of Gottskalk Nicholson, who had been Jón Arason's predecessor back in Holar. Oder had secretly converted while studying in Denmark and Germany, and he was spending his free time secretly translating a Lutheran version of the New Testament into Icelandic out in Ominder's barn.
It does not seem like Ominder was at all aware of Gissur's thoughts on Lutheranism when he chose him as his successor, or that there were other Lutherans in his household and staff. When he realized what was happening, he was not happy about it. He wrote to Jón Arason, complaining about Gissur's actions and claiming he had taken silver and other church property from the cathedral to his own residence. Jón was still upholding Catholic traditions in the north of Iceland, and he was alarmed by what was happening in the south. But it also seems like he thought it was prudent to keep a positive working relationship with Gissur as his counterpart in the southern diocese. Jón and Gissur agreed to help and support one another through a covenant of friendship and mutual aid.
King Christian dispatched a new governor to Iceland. That was Christopher Huitfeldt, who arrived in May of 1541, along with 2 warships. Christopher was tasked with converting Iceland to Lutheranism and with implementing a new tax to help the king pay off the debt from the Count's War that had put him on the throne. With Gissur in charge, the diocese at Skálholt quickly adopted all of this. But Jón and his council wrote to the king to say that they would pay this tax in exchange for maintaining their religious liberty and their traditional customs.
In the summer of 1541, the governor started making plans to take Ömmundur into custody. Although Ömmundur had retired, he had not yet left Skálholt. Some of his friends convinced him that it would be safer for him to retire to a monastery, and on the way there, he stopped to visit his sister. On June 2nd, 1541, some of the governor's men showed up while Ömmundur was still sleeping, forced him out of his sister's house, still in his nightclothes, and put him on a Danish ship. He was deported, and he either died on the journey or sometime within a couple of years of arriving in Denmark, remembering that he was a very old man through all of this.
Yeah, I think they did let him change into something other than his nightclothes, but he was described as still, like, he was not adequately dressed. When Ömmundur was planning this journey to this monastery, Gissur had told him he did not have anything to worry about, but Gissur was definitely involved in this whole abduction and deportation plan. He may have actually instigated it, but that part is less clear. Gissur later wrote to Jón Arason saying he believed what he had done was for the greater good, and he asked Jón not to believe any, quote, evil rumors that he might hear. Jón agreed to this, saying that if he were to hear any slander about Gissur, he would not believe it unless he received some kind of certified documentary proof.
Jón Arason had been traveling south for the Althing when Ömmundur was abducted and deported, and when he heard about it, he turned back. He sent letters to the Althing and to the governor forbidding any action against his diocese. Without Jón and Ömmundur there to argue against it, this time the Althing agreed to adopt the Lutheran Church order. But since the diocese at Hólar was not represented at the Althing when this was decided, it was not considered to apply to them.
For a while, Jón didn't really interfere with what was happening in the southern diocese. While he thought Gissur's acceptance of Lutheranism was heresy, Gissur had also been lawfully appointed as bishop of the diocese. Jón also agreed to pay the taxes and assist Danish officials as long as he and his diocese were able to maintain their Catholic religion and customs.
In 1542, King Christian III ordered Gissur and Jón to come to Copenhagen. Gissur went, but Jón said he was ill and he sent delegates in his place, one of them being his son Sigurdur. Sigurdur and Gissur both signed on to the Lutheran ordinance while there, and a priest who had traveled with Sigurdur started preaching Lutheran doctrine when they got back to Iceland. Jón refused to be bound by the ordinance that his son had signed as his delegate, but for the moment, Christian seems to have considered the matter settled and didn't do much to interfere with the North.
This kind of uneasy peace did not last, though, and we will get to that after a sponsor break. On Good Friday of 1548, Bishop Gissur Einarsson died at the age of only 36. He had gone to Kaldatharnes, which is southeast of Reykjavik, to remove a wooden cross that had long been seen as a healing relic and was frequently used as a pilgrimage site, obviously among Catholics. Gisser got sick and died after returning to Skalholt from that trip. When Jón heard about his death, he rode to Skalholt and on the way wrote a letter offering to handle any church and religious matters and nothing else until a replacement could be elected as bishop of the southern diocese.
Before the start of Christian III's efforts to make Iceland a Lutheran country, this would have been a completely normal and uncontroversial thing to do. With Gisser's death, Jón was the only Catholic bishop in Iceland. The Archdiocese of Nidaros had been dissolved as Christian III had converted Norway to Lutheranism. So Jón was also reporting directly to the Pope and was seen as the Pope's representative in Iceland. It was routine for an Icelandic bishop to take on or at least assist with the duties of his counterpart at the other diocese if he died or for some other reason was incapacitated. But the Protestant Reformation made all of this a whole lot more complicated, especially as the Reformation and Counter-Reformation had led to wars in other parts of Europe.
Jón also did not simply step in to keep things running in the southern diocese after Gisser's death. He started trying to reestablish Catholicism there. He chose an abbot named Sigvardur Halldórsson as Gisser's replacement and sent him to Denmark to be consecrated. Of course, Lutheran church authorities in Denmark were not going to do that. They did not consecrate Sigvardur as bishop, and they also did not let him leave Denmark. Sigvardur died in Denmark a couple of years later after having first become a Lutheran. Lutherans had also put forth their own candidate for that bishop spot, an Icelandic priest named Martin Einarsson. Martin was already in Copenhagen. He became Bishop of Skalholt instead.
Before Martin returned from Denmark, Jón continued trying to re-implement Catholicism in the south, with the help of people living there who were still Catholic. This included reconsecrating monasteries and cathedrals, including the monastery at Vide. He arrested Lutheran clerics and forced them to either readopt Catholicism or to leave Iceland. Jón also declared Gisser a heretic, exhuming his body from its grave and throwing it into a pit. In the late summer of 1548, some of Jón's men lay siege to Skalholt for 8 days, but they were ultimately repelled, thanks to its having been fortified by Martin's brother Pjotr. Martin and Pjotr's brother-in-law, Dadi Guthmundsson, was also heavily involved in the Lutheran opposition to Jón's efforts.
There was another pause in the winter as the seas once again became impassable. But on February 11th, 1549, the king declared Jón Arason outlawed. When Martin Einarsson arrived back in Iceland in the spring, he was carrying a summons for Jón's arrest. And of course, Jón considered that to be invalid. Dadi Guthmundsson started working with the latest Icelandic governor, Laurentius Mulla, to try to get the king to condemn Jón. Instead, the king ordered Dadi to arrest Jón and his sons, thinking this would be a lot less bloody and expensive than sending some more warships and trying to fight over it.
Meanwhile, Jón had written a letter to Pope Paul III, asking for guidance for what to do with donations that normally would have gone to the Archdiocese at Nidaros. The Pope's response was to distribute them to the poor. The Pope also described Jón as pious and full of veneration and obedience toward the Pope and the Holy See. This letter said in part, quote, "We therefore pronounce on you our highest recognition in the Lord and exhort you, with the flock entrusted to you, to persevere in the same mind. For this you will receive praise from men here on earth and from God himself, eternal life in heaven." Jón saw this as confirmation that what he was doing was right and had the Pope's support, and he had it translated into Icelandic, and then he distributed that around the diocese.
Then Jón sent two of his sons to Skalholt to try to arrest Martin Einarsson and Daði Guðmundsson. One of the sons, Ari, was a lawmother, or a lawyer, or law speaker, and the other one, Bjorn, was a priest. They did manage to capture the bishop, but Daði's men reportedly put on gray clothing to camouflage themselves and then were able to ambush Jón's men and drive them back.
Bishop Martin was kept in Ari's custody at a monastery where he was forced to work drying cod. We said earlier that most of Jón Arason's poetry was religious, but he also wrote a number of insulting poems about Martin while he was in custody, and about a cleric named Arni Arnarsson, who had also been captured.
In 1550, the next time the Althing convened, Jón, Ari, and Bjorn were all there. Jón with 200 men, and Ari and Bjorn with 100 men apiece. Before the gathered assembly, they all declared that one of the very prominent Lutheran priests in Iceland was a heretic. Ultimately, that led this priest to flee to Denmark.
Later in the summer, Jón and Daði arranged a thing at which they would discuss their various grievances. But once they were there, Daði announced that he was going to put things off until the next Althing the following spring. An official thing was supposed to come along with protections for its participants, but postponing the proceedings meant those protections essentially disappeared. Realizing they were under threat, Jón declared himself and his sons to be under the king's protection, but Daði's men took them captive.
Something else that was supposed to happen at this point was that the three men would be held until they could be tried at the next Althing. Christian Skriver, who was the governor's representative, took custody of Jón and his sons on October 23rd, 1550. So the idea was they were going to hold them until the following summer. But everybody knew that doing that would be challenging at best. Even with the reduced travel during the colder months, there would probably be people from the north who would be coming to Jón's defense. Unrest would probably be spreading through and from the north without Jón there.
This led to a lot of discussion among Jón's captors, and a clergyman named Jón Bjarnason is often cited as offering this solution, quote, "The axe and the earth will keep them best." On November 6, 1550, Christian Skriver gave a recitation of all the purported crimes of Jón Arason and his sons. And even though there had been no real trial, they were all beheaded the next day.
Various accounts give some different details, but Ari Jónsson was beheaded first, with his head severed in one blow. Bjorn Jónsson was next, and it took 4 blows to decapitate him. And then for Jón Arason, it took 7 blows. And he gave his last words after the third, saying in Latin, "Into your hands, Lord, I commend my spirit." He died at the age of 66, or, 76, if you're looking at that date discrepancy. The story that our guide, God, told us on our trip about why it took 7 blows was that the regular executioner didn't want to behead Jón Arason. So this task instead fell to somebody who was not considered to be particularly smart and did not have a sharp axe.
If Danish authorities were trying to avoid a hassle by executing Jón and his sons rather than holding them until the Althing, that really did not work out for them. Especially in the north of Iceland, Jón was immediately seen as a martyr. A force from the north, which may have been sent by Jón's daughter, Thorn, marched to Skalholt and killed every Danish person there.
In the spring, another party was sent from Holar to claim the bodies of Jón and his sons. Their bodies were exhumed and placed in coffins, still covered in mud. Those coffins had bells attached, and they were carried from Skalholt back to Holar. This party stopped at Laugarvatn, which was home to a consecrated hot spring where the bodies were washed before being returned to their coffins. There are 6 stones beside this pool, which, according to tradition, are where the coffins were laid while the bodies were being cleaned and prepared.
Also, according to legend, church bells rang as this processional passed on the way back to Holar. This ended with the largest bell at the Holar Cathedral, which started ringing by itself as the procession came down into the valley, and continued ringing until they were in sight of town, at which point it cracked.
There had, once again, been very little Danish presence in Iceland over the winter of 1550 to 1551 because they were all dead. But 4 Danish warships arrived in the spring and troops started marching on the north. They had been sent to arrest Jón Arason, not knowing when they set sail that he had already been executed. Jón was posthumously condemned as a traitor, and troops reestablished Danish and Lutheran control over Iceland. Catholicism was made illegal, and Catholics were outlawed. The remaining monastic houses in Iceland were dissolved, and their assets were all seized, and that included that chalice that Jón had delivered the gold for early in his years as a priest. During all of this, Jón's common-law wife, Helga Sigurðsdóttir, had to go into hiding. Most Catholic Icelanders who refused to convert to Lutheranism left. A lot of them went to Scotland, where, for the moment, Catholicism was still legal, but then that changed in 1560.
From an outsider's perspective, Jón Arason's legacy is fascinating. Jón died as one of the wealthiest men in all of Iceland, if not the wealthiest. He had stewardship of more than 350 estates. One of the sources used in this episode said that he controlled 18% of Iceland's real estate. There was one Danish official who wrote that if you were riding through Iceland and asked whose farm that was, the answer was either Bishop Jóns or Bjorn Jónsson's. He was incredibly rich at a time when people in Iceland overwhelmingly were not, and he faced criticism for that wealth while he was alive. But he and his sons, Ari and Bjorn, are also seen as emblematic of Iceland's past. 19th century Icelandic historian Jón Sigurðsson called them the last Icelanders.
There's another degree of irony in Jón Arason's status as a national hero in Iceland. He was fighting against something that's now part of the national fabric of Iceland. Today, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Iceland is the state church of Iceland. More than 60% of the population are members. The religion Jón observed and fought for was outlawed in Iceland for centuries, with Catholics only starting to return to Iceland in the extremely late 18th and early 19th centuries. The Apostolic Prefecture of Iceland was established in 1923, and it became the Roman Catholic Diocese of Reykjavik in 1968. According to Statistics Iceland, only 3.9% of people in Iceland are Catholic today, and between 2/3 and 3/4 of those are people who immigrated to Iceland from places where Catholicism is a lot more widely practiced.
This irony connects to some debate and varying interpretations around Jón's motivations. How much of it was about religious faith, how much about his ambition and personal wealth, and how that was tied to the Catholic Church, and how much was about wanting Iceland to be free of royal control by Denmark. That last part is definitely connected to his status as an icon and national hero. Centuries passed before Iceland became independent. It became a sovereign state in a union with Denmark in 1918 and an independent republic in 1944.
There's also a saying that all Icelanders are descended from Jón Arason. The Icelandic Web of Science website tackled the question of whether this was true in a 2005 piece by the late Gisli Gunnarsson, who had been a history professor at the University of Iceland. This was translated into English by Nicholas Jones. This piece looked at math and at historical laws banning marriages between third and fourth cousins, and of course, people more closely related than that. This piece approximated that a person living in 2005 would have about 65,536 ancestors who were alive in 1484 when Jón Arason was born. The population of Iceland in 1484 was probably less than that. And some of the people living in 1484 would, for various reasons, not ever have any children. So this article concluded it is at least possible that everyone with Icelandic heritage is related to Jón Arason in some way.
Do you have listener mail to take us out?
I do have listener mail. This is from Lorena. And Lorena wrote, "Hi, Holly and Tracy. I listened to your SL1 reactor episode and the replay of the Demon Core episode with great interest/horror this week. The extreme laxity in nuclear safety standards of the mid-century was a surprise to me since I grew up in a nuclear town, Pickering, Ontario. As a child in the early 90s, we had nuclear drills, which consisted of hiding under our desk, ? And being told that our teachers would issue us a potassium iodide pill if there was a real nuclear incident. Details were not provided, and since my main source of knowledge about nuclear exposure was the historical fiction about Sadako-chan and the 1,000 paper cranes, I was under the impression that we would invariably die painful deaths if we were exposed to any radiation whatsoever. Nonetheless, it was clear that there was a protocol. Then in 2000, my grade 13 OAC for the Ontarians out there art project was helping paint a mural for the lunchroom at the nuclear plant. We painted the panels off-site, and I was only permitted a single tour of the working part of the plant after assuring them there was zero chance I could be pregnant. Even so, the staff got quite sharp with me because I kept putting my pen cap in my mouth as the tour began. The art opening was held outdoors, and attendees were only permitted to go in briefly in small groups to view the mural, wearing safety gear. So it seemed Pickering was very safety conscious. Wikipedia reveals that, in fact, the plant operations were rather lax at times, but we were blissfully ignorant. Thanks for your work. I've learned so much from the podcast. In remittance of my pet tax, here are my weird little guys, Pippin and Mary. Pippin and Mary are so cute.
Babies.
I don't know all the cat breeds, but these look like Siamese to me. And they are lounging in almost a little train along the back of a couch. Super duper cute. Thank you so much, Lorena, for this episode. A couple of random things. One of the reasons there used to be duck and cover drills, like people like to make fun of duck and cover drills, because it does seem completely pointless that if there was going to be a massive radiation exposure, how is hiding under your desk going to work? And the idea was that if you were not like at the center of the blast, there would be, the force of an explosion also happening. So being under the desk was meant to protect you from things like falling debris. But it does seem kind of silly because also radiation happening. I don't know if Lorena has heard it, but we do have a 2-part episode back when we were celebrating our 1,000th episode of the podcast about Sadako Sasaki, so folding 1,000 paper cranes, if folks want to go listen to that. And then I was sort of delighted by the whole putting your pen cap in your mouth being a cause for alarm. It totally makes sense why that would be the case, but yeah. I get that. And what great kitty cats.
Also, I have gone to open the email myself. We don't always both have them open when we're doing it. And yes, I would say those are chocolate point Siamese.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for the confirmation of that. So thank you so much again. If you would like to send us an email, we're at historypodcast@iHeartRadio.com. You can also subscribe to our show on the iHeartRadio app or anywhere else you'd like to get your podcasts. Stuff You Missed in History Class is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.